Before I start, I just want to make a quick shout out, though, to Don, but especially to Serge, to Esther, Chiara, all your help. It's been awesome. Let's say, this has really been just a great conference. It's really an honor to be here. And I just think it's awesome to have a job where we get to travel to places like this and hang out with people like you. So it's a blessing, and I really appreciate it. So I added a subtitle to my talk today. So Serge asked me to talk about open badges and ePortfolios and competency-based education. And I added to that a bit of a framing that I'm really working on with my work. Now, it's really competencies in context. I think that that's probably one of the most important things, particularly in the US. The notion of competency-based ed really is, it's not going away. It's not brand new, as some people are arguing, but it's really becoming quite entrenched. And one of the things that digital badges can do some very important work around allowing competency-based approaches to do really what they can do while also addressing some of the concerns that many people have about at least some of the way that competency-based ed is going. So, first and foremost, the MacArthur Foundation has been generously supported my work, but really much of what we're doing here, we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for the vision that Connie Yowell sort of brought forth, really starting about 2005, and which really came together in the 2011 with the launch of the Badges for Lifelong Learning. But other support for my work is from Google as well as Indiana University, and I gratefully acknowledge their support. So let's talk about competency-based ed. How many of you have seen this slide? It makes quite a bit of rounds. It should be a very familiar framing. On the left, you see very traditional, time-based. Sometimes it gets lambasted as credit for time served. Driven by textbooks, teacher-centered decision-making. I find this dichotomous approach a little false at times. I think it sets up these things in opposition, but this is the way that a lot of the discourse is happening, particularly in higher education, and particularly in training, and particularly in the US. We've seen lots of articles. Time is right to colleges for colleges to shift from assembly line education. A lot of important things. How many of you are familiar with IMS Global? Yeah, so IMS is now very deeply involved in the Open Badge Extensions in Education project. And they decide what things get called in practice. So it's really important the way that competency is characterized, because what's happening more and more is technology becomes more and more important. The metadata becomes very important, and if you don't have the right metadata labels for things, it imposes a lot of structure. And I will qualify this by saying, I'm not a technologist, I'm actually a psychologist. Sometimes I introduce myself as a recovering psychometrician, sort of born to measure stuff. And if you don't, your calipers matter. So, speaking of IMS Global, Mark Luba, good friend Mark Luba, is heading up the Open Badge Extensions in Education project, and he did this article in EDUCAUSE Review recently, which is a pretty good summary of CBE and the way it's being framed. Meet students where they are in their educational journey, to provide a more personalized path to completion, structure to demonstrate learning, and clearly articulated competencies is often self-paced. And for many of us, especially in the learning sciences, that sort of raises some red flags, because a lot of the kinds of learning that we care about, if people are off learning, they use the word personalized, but the more appropriate term is isolated and individualized. It's very difficult when you're working in self-paced settings to be interacting with people. So like you see these things like a self-paced module on collaborative learning. That's not, I mean, it's true. There's a lot of stuff like that out there. So, and I could talk forever about that issue, and I've got some examples of how we're finding ways of getting participatory learning occurring in self-paced online contexts. If you'd like to know more about that, I'll have to talk about it later. But one of the key points is this next one, is agnostic as to the source of learning. Think about that for a second. Agnostic as to the source of learning. The point is that they don't really care where learning is coming from. And as an assessment specialist, that's the kind of thing they go, really? What does that really mean? And I'll unpack that a little bit here. The typical benefits of CBE. A big project just getting underway in the US, Project Equip. How many of you have heard of Project Equip or familiar with it? So this is going to open the floodgates and allow federal funding, financial aid to start going to boot camps They brought in a whole alternative accreditation structure and everything, and this is a very big deal because that's a huge amount of money that currently many competency-based programs and many boot camps, which are often quite competency-based, have no access to financial aid whatsoever in the U.S. So this innovation is not to be taken lightly. And neither is CBE. It's definitely, I think it's here to stay. I think it's definitely not a fad. This was just published last week, Quality Standards for Competency-Based Education Programs. Competency-Based Education Network is 30 U.S. colleges. They claim over 600 colleges in the U.S. are initiating competency-based ed programs. Associate Vice Provost at my university came to me about a month ago and said, the provost said that we need to do something in competency-based education, do something. And that's what's happening. I was like, really? Okay, we can do something. We are doing something. So here are the 8 principles in this thing. I want to focus on one of them today. The third one, credential level assessment strategy with robust implementation. And here are 4 of the 8 standards that are included. Standard 3, ability to apply or transfer that learning in novel contexts. That's a bigger challenge than many people think it is. Standard 6, clear and valid measures. Anyone, that ring any alarm bells for anyone? What?
Sure, it's hard.
Yeah. Validity is not a property of an assessment. First and foremost, validity is a property of a claim. So to a lot of us are going, okay, wait a minute, let's really, how serious are you thinking about assessment in this context? So case in point, the standards for educational and psychological testing. This is the 4th edition of this volume that has been around for 40 years. And this one just came out now 3 years ago. Validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores for the proposed uses of tests. It is the interpretation of test scores for the proposed uses that are evaluated, not the test itself. It is incorrect to use the unqualified phrase, the validity of the test. So my point here is just that there's a lot of work, there's a lot of stuff happening because competency-based education is in and of itself an assessment-driven reform. And we've seen a lot of assessment-driven reforms either come and go or morph into something that they weren't intended to be. I started my career as a postdoctoral fellow at Educational Testing Service. In 1994, I accepted a postdoc there to help support this explosion of innovation in K-12 assessment, performance, and portfolio assessment. And by the time I got to ETS in 95 to start my postdoc, the whole thing had collapsed in the US because they weren't attending to the issues of validity and the consequences of assessment. I don't think CBE is going to collapse the way that collapsed, but I think if CBE is going to deliver its promised improvements, we have to attend to some of these issues. Carnegie Foundation, of course, they're the people who invented the credit union, so it's not the credit unit, sorry. But I thought this was a pretty thoughtful report where they went through and said, you know, okay, but let's think about this. What are some of the concerns that we have about moving away from time-based to competency-based education? May privilege some students over others. Teachers rank differentiation as most challenging. This is a hard thing for many teachers to make this shift. And even once they've made the shift, it's a lot to keep up with where 30 students are at working on their own pace. Particular as a learning scientist, it's the 4th point, supplants other kinds of instruction that the latest learning sciences research encourages. Again, it's very hard to make a claim that somebody's learning, that somebody's engaging in collaborative learning and learning to participate in meaningful disciplinary discourse when they're not participating in disciplinary discourse beyond interacting with static educational resources. In particular, overlooks the limits of assessments, portfolios, and testing. So, I'd like to share some lessons we learned. Thanks to the MacArthur Foundation, I was able to spend 2 years studying what became of the 29 projects that were funded in the 2012 Badges for Lifelong Learning Initiative. Had an awesome team, including Nate Otto, who was our project director. 30 very diverse projects were funded in this. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this larger initiative. Here you can see that they really did come from in terms of earners, standards, accreditation, and setting, they really covered the gamut. They did a great job getting very diverse projects. What we set out to do was something that was, I could never find another study that had done it, which is try to capture the practical wisdom that emerged in the context of these efforts. We looked in terms of the functions of badges. This is building on some of my assessment work. You can distinguish between the purposes of badges and the functions of badges. And I would argue that you should always be looking at the functions, because purposes often overlooks the unintended positive and negative consequences of your intentions. And the functions we came up with are recognizing learning, right? That's obvious with badges. Assessing learning, if you're going to recognize learning, you're probably going to have some kind of assessment. The motivational part, though, if you're going to be recognizing and assessing learning, you're going to be impacting motivation, whether you know it or not, or whether you admit it or not. And then finally, the studying learning, right? In many cases, because badges contain claims and evidence and can contain, right? They have to contain claims. The evidence field is optional, but ideally a badge would have contained within it the evidence and the links to additional evidence that supports those claims. So in many educational ecosystems, it's the perfect opportunity to document and study learning. I'm disappointed by how far we've come in the past 4 years, but nonetheless, we looked at that. We did it by looking at the intended practices. We did a content analysis of their proposals. What are their intended practices for using digital badges? We then followed up with those projects. You were planning on using ePortfolios to support public discourse. How's that going? And then finally, we followed up after the projects were over, after the funding was over. Were you able to sustain that practice? We came up with an initial set with a card sort. And then the other thing we're trying to do is we're trying to benchmark these principles with external outside research. I know a thing or two about motivation. I've written quite a bit about it. I know about rewards, incentives. So how can we bring that knowledge to bear with all of this innovation that's happening in the space? For example, this is one in terms of recognizing learning. 23 of these projects articulated a specific goal of aligning badges with standards in those 3 different configurations. And so what we have in our data set, it is the DPD project. If you Google it, you'll find it, is all of the really extensive case studies from these projects. So we tried to look across projects. The apparent, so in 2014, was the badge system, was there no badge system? Was the intended badge system there? Or was a different one there? And then the ecosystem, same thing. But also, we followed up in 2015 and said, okay, it's been a year now. Is there a badge-based learning ecosystem out there that we can point to and say is thriving? In other words, what were the configurations of projects that left behind a thriving badge-based educational ecosystem? Let me quickly go through this. I'll start with the 6 projects that intended to use ePortfolios. You see that 2 of these projects were suspended. Basically, they never got beyond the pilot stage. One of them was a partial implementation. Only 2 of them were left behind what we deemed to be thriving badge-based ecosystems. One of them was Student Reporting Lab. The 2 thriving systems had, not really surprising, they both started with existing educational content and an existing web system. They didn't try to build content, badges, and technology with $200,000. They were also using media-related projects, which lend themselves well to the kind of social learning. So there was already a lot of social interaction around there to badge. One of them was, and the other thing that both of these projects had was just 2 brilliant women behind them. Stacy Cruz and Leah Clapman did a fabulous job. Stacy built a pretty amazing website for their project. But they also did something really important. They didn't go in and map really specific competencies. They included the competencies, but they didn't assess them precisely. So when you got for instance, the videographer badge, but it didn't go through and check off all of the specific things. The badge was awarded for completing the project. The competencies were more implicit in the badges. And this is one of the big findings across these projects. They also had a very clever thing. There was the initial SRL badge. You earned this badge by simply uploading a story, filling out the 6 reflections, and mashing the button, and you got the badge. And that unlocked all of the other badges. Lots of little clever things like that brought students in. What I really liked about their project was this career-ready skill badge. This is there were these big deals, these sort of all-star badges. Well, those badges went to they were with partner affiliates with public broadcasting stations. Those badges didn't go for final approval to somebody at the PBS station until the teacher had already screened them. So they weren't sending over a bunch of stuff and asking an outside expert to scrutinize them for evidence of competency. And that's one of the mistakes some of the other projects made. This is this badge review system. Again, I thought Stacy Cruz just did a fabulous job. Quarterly school principal reports that sends out to all the stakeholders a list of the names of all of the students who have earned this career-ready badge with a thank you for them. So lots of very clever features. Similarly, the Supporter to Reporters medals in the UK. Supporters, right, these are soccer fans, so let's take soccer fans and turn them into soccer reporters instead of letting them turn into soccer hooligans. Sort of the narrative around it. Again, these badges were not, they were awarded for completing projects and participating in activities. They were awarded for things that many proponents of CBE deride as attendance badges. There's some serious tension here over that. The assessment was social and distributed. Both of these projects, they were cohorts of students cohorts of learners going through and doing projects together and interacting together, commenting on each other's work. And again, they layered open badges into existing content and website. Had a really nice website. Look at the first criteria. Worked as part of Sainsbury 2013 school games. So there's this theme throughout it, worked as, participated in. And they didn't go through again and tick off all of the individual specific competencies. And this raises this question. We were speaking with Layla earlier. It's like this balance between rigor and so the point is this is one of the projects that ended up thriving. Come on. As Lucy said, so they gave badges for taking on professional roles. They abandoned any sort of formal credentialing. And I love her line here. They're thinking really thoughtfully about the issue of endorsement. Getting endorsements after you have earned a badge. You can earn a badge for an internship. The employer can also add an endorsement. So they're really thinking, and a lot of this is going into Open Badge Factory, these designs of really thinking broadly about endorsement. The metaphor she uses is eBay, the whole idea of multi-point comparison. So I argued in a paper that was just in the Evolution magazine with 3 L's, Evolution and Lifelong Learning, that we can think a lot about badges right now or digital credentials as analogous to e-commerce. Right? If we think about it, we're about where e-commerce was in 1995, where there's still a bunch of people saying, badges are just a fad. My point is if you're saying digital credentials are a fad, you're going to look, and you're an educational institution, you're going to look an awful lot like publishers in 95 who were dismissing the internet as a fad. So, what about these other projects? Well, the UC Davis, the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Safety, is still being described in the media as if UC Davis adopted this whole thing. They didn't. There's an existing degree program there, and it is not competency-based. This thing never got beyond pilot stage. It got a lot of press. Really, really intensive competency mapping, just no way. It was just, they couldn't make the transition. It didn't happen. The Asia Society projects was one of part. Gates funded 3 of those projects in their Project Mastery, and they were very deliberately trying to move high schools away from credit-based courses to competency-based courses. It's hard to know exactly what to say when a project doesn't come together, but the Show Evidence just had this incredibly ambitious plan for they were going to get global experts to go through these very, very long lists of competencies and say that and certify high school kids as being globally competent, and it never got beyond the pilot stage. I'll return to that. 4-H, one of the design principles here is don't give redundant badges, right? 4-H, when they built their badge system, they tried to replicate the social network, clubs and fairs, credentials, trophies, and ribbons, and then this record book that they had. And their portfolios were going we're going to double up. And it's just, the minute they ran into trouble, people said, we don't really need this. We've already got these things. So basically that system was paused. They're doing some other really nice stuff now. Sweetwater Aquaponds have, again, a very ambitious assessment plan, scaled it way back, and now it's one of the Summer of Learning, the Project LRNG projects, with a much, much lighter footprint and all non-school work. So one of the conclusions of our projects is badges appear to work better in some places than others. This is what the data looks like across them. You can see that of the 29, only 16 ended up designing the badge system. We concluded built the badge system that they proposed. And of those 16, only 11 of them had sort of the educational ecosystem that was sort of envisioned. And then finally, only 6 of these resulted in thriving badge-based ecosystems at the end of the project. So we sort of just took a step back last year, and this is one of the reasons this report hasn't been published yet. What is it about them? How can we characterize them? And I concluded that 5 of these projects really were, including the first 2 that I talked about, you can really characterize the practices that were going on there using more of a sociocultural lens. There was a lot of social learning. The assessment was very peer-driven. There was cohorts of people going through and learning things. Whereas the competency-based programs are very consistent with a more associationist view of learning, and you can see that only one of them. So there's a big divergence there in how successful these programs were. Another set of them really were more constructivist, more problem-based learning. They were mixed in terms of outcomes, and then there were hybrid projects that really had all 3 kinds of these practices represented. So we can slice these in different ways. What happened to the 7 projects that were actually competency-based? These are your competencies. This should be quite familiar to a lot of people. So what a lot of people, when they think of badges, and in particular, CBE was already around when badges showed up. And so many of them really seized on badges and say, oh, this is exactly what we've been waiting for. So it's really worth taking a relatively quick spin through these things and seeing what happened. As I already mentioned, SA and FS was suspended. All 3 of the Gates Project Mastery projects, despite the fact that I don't know the exact number, but I think it was on the order of 10 times the funding, like $2 million apiece. A lot of money went into them. None of them made it past pilot stage. This was the Pathways of Global Competency, Level Up in Colorado, Youth Filmmaker. And Gates being Gates, they funded a very exhaustive and a very expensive formal evaluation of those 3 projects that's on the web. If you want to see it, it's Competency-Based Education. And it was really helpful for me because they found in great detail what I found in not as much detail. So for example, the Youth Filmmaker project, they quote a teacher. So they spent a lot of time trying to align their badges to Common Core standards. So they were asking teachers, well, would you accept this badge in lieu of having a student do a narrative writing project in class? She said, absolutely not. No, I'm really happy that they're doing this after school, but learning to write a script in an after-school setting is not the same as students doing a narrative writing module in my class. They're different things. And so this was present across all of these projects. Coming back to the point I made earlier about being agnostic as to the source of learning, this is something that we as a community need to think about a lot. I think it's an area where badges, because they can provide some context that will make it better for those kinds of decisions to be made. A whole bunch of barriers to it. So again, we'll move through this pretty quickly. Skills USA, one of the problems, one of the mistakes I believe that they made was they tried to get their badges certified in advance. They went to the manufacturers and said, if somebody earns this badge, will you give them a job? And they said, no, we're not going to do that. Whereas the other projects that were more successful, instead of putting a lot of energy into getting that certification happening, they put all of their energy into really evidence-rich badges that could be used to convince somebody to give them an internship or a job, rather than getting all that certification up in front. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem. You also, I think, was a particularly good one. Young Adult Library Services Administration, they were quite frank. They said that people told us to make these badges really valuable. Like these badges really need to mean something. So they had this really long list of competencies that you had to go off and find someone else to be endorsed to endorse your competencies. And so they've issued like 2 badges. So again, just an unrealistic view of how much assessment of specific competencies a system can stand given the value of the badge. BuzzMath did get up and running, but their badges are not open. They're just tokens in a drill and practice system. Again, these projects that were quite successful, Mouse Wins is another one. The learning was very social. A lot of badges were awarded for completion of group projects. Again, this kinds of badges that are often derided as being attendance badges. I actually think Mouse is doing a very good job training young people to be network administrators in their high schools. Cooper Hewitt Design Prep was another one of these ones that I'm characterizing as being more consistent with sociocultural practices, and then Design for America. The project-based ones, much more mixed outcome. Again, a lot of these projects really struggled to carry out the amount of assessment that they had anticipated doing. And the hybrid projects were kind of mixed. This report that I hope to have done in about 2 weeks is to give you an idea of the kinds of principles we have. One of the struggles with this is how contextual these principles are. It's really hard to take these principles in the abstract and trying to write this up in a way that other people can use it and draw from these experiences has been a challenge. That's an idea, hopefully, next month. Let me wrap up with just a couple of comments. So there's a couple of blog posts up about some things that have happened over this last year. My blog is Remediating Assessment. We managed to get a really nice meeting together at the ABLE conference in Boston. We had most of the ePortfolio providers and most of the badge providers and 4 professional associations in the room, essentially getting consensus around the fact that we all need to be working together around these open badge standards. Like, that was the main point of the meeting. It seems to have been reasonably successful. This was the ABLE conference. This was that meeting. Those are on my blog. So Pete and I were talking about this yesterday. So what's happening right now is in the ePortfolio space, there's a lot of work being done with digital badges. A lot of, and I'm sure Pete's going to kind of clarify on this, but this is what I believe the current status is of the various ePortfolio platforms and where they are with integrating badges. And I want to take just a second and talk about one of them who wasn't at our meeting, Portfolium, who are really catching a lot of attention, particularly in California, because more than anyone, they appear to really be in the voc ed space, bringing employers into the equation. So this is literally, I just was introduced to Lewis last night. This is his Portfolium. When I connected with him, I immediately got an email, and you can see there, now this is the kind of thing they're doing, working towards this idea of a learning recognition network. When I connected with him, I got an email back, and included in that email was there on the right, it says, here's some other people you might know. So it told me about all the other people in Portfolium at Indiana University. You might know these people. These are some of his badges. This is the Credly integration. Is just getting underway now, so it's a little clumsy, but these are his Credly badges in Portfolium. If you go to for instance, the HIPAA badge, which in the U.S. this is Health Information Privacy and Protection Act. It's a really very important in our healthcare system about student privacy, or about patient privacy. When I clicked on his HIPAA badge, in this case, I had to cut and paste the Credly URL and go to Credly to find this information, the successful completion of the HIPAA curriculum with a score of 70%. So that was not in Portfolium. So I understand they're doing quite a bit of work now, but what I thought was interesting is when I went back into Portfolium last night and asked him a question about his badge, can you say a bit more about what you did to get this badge? Was it in a class? Do you think you can navigate? So I made up a question. Do you think you can navigate HIPAA in a university research context with children? This is what I got back. It's quite a bit. Certainly if I was looking for someone, a writer perhaps, whose brevity was valued, I might not be so interested in this person. But to me, this is coming back to this issue of context. Now, what's interesting to me is he went and looked at my profile and figured out that I'm not an employer. He figured out that I'm an educational researcher and responded accordingly. So and again, I literally just got this morning, but he added a lot of additional information that adds value to that badge. Now again, if I was an employer, I'm confident that he would have responded differently, but I thought that was a fairly nice articulation of what he had to do. So this comment is included in the badge, and this is the stuff that, if we're going to have this idea of this learning recognition network, this is the stuff that we need to be working towards. Do you think you can navigate HIPAA? That was a fairly convincing answer. I thought that was, so this information is buried in these spaces, but people can drill down to it as they need it. And to me, that's the real power of badges, is this idea of competencies in context. Badges can add in the contextual information that competency-based approaches often strip out in a problematic way. And I think I'll just close with that note. Oh, no, I won't. One more thing. This is their jobs thing. It's a really impressive interface. I'm just finding my way around, but you can, this is, you know, it's free to students. Employers can go in, have to pay to get access to it, and there's a lot of claims being made. I haven't verified them that indeed employers are successfully using this system to find entry-level workers with the skills they need based on their portfolios and their badges. So that's the interface. Final note. They were in Mahara originally, and they switched. So what excites me is people like these two really going at it and competing, like this the space of competition that we're seeing emerge, where we have both open source and for-profit providers competing to make platforms around open badge standards that do more and more. Look at the last line. Portfolio replaces chalk and wire and plans to have a future rollout. So Chalk and Wire is actually working on my mantle. They're the ones who coined the term learning recognition network. And so they're actually playing catch up in a sense with what we're seeing here. And to me, that's the really exciting thing, is to see this kind of talent working around a common set of open badge standards. Thank you.
To still exist relate to whether or not some learners were thriving or not?
Oh, God. I've really been struggling with that very question. My data doesn't really support that kind of strong conclusion. I'm still struggling with what conclusions I can draw from the data we have. So I honestly don't know the answer to that question, because we didn't have IRB approval to interview. So we actually weren't allowed, and by the design of the project, we weren't allowed to interact with the learners at all. My guess, though, is the answer was yes, some of them. And yeah, I'm struggling with that. Another proposal we're working on right now, to the extent to which we bring in this sort of traditional ed psych approach, that different kinds of badges for different kinds of learners. I'm working with Ann Renninger, who's an interest researcher, with the idea that some people need badges and some people don't. If people are already interested in topics, her hypothesis is badges might just get in the way, consistent with DC and Ryan's notions of an over-justification effect.
One more question?
Thanks, Dan. I'm just fascinated by the fact that some of these projects, seem to engage the learner on that participatory level. And I wonder how much that has to do with just the developmental stage at which they're engaging with these practices, where we might expect them to see and be more interested in those more detailed aspects of the competency as they grow up, where, as certainly high school students are maybe thinking about careers but aren't quite at that state. We have to get them on the pathway somewhere, and I wonder if that's why these were successful.
I think, and I'm really struggling with how to so Mimi Ito was the one who I worked with on defining this proposal, and I'm really trying hard to be objective about it, because I'm a recovering psychometrician. I'm also a born-again situative theorist. That is the tradition in which most of my work does, and learners really do want to walk the walk and talk the talk. They want to embody expertise. They want to participate in disciplinary discourse with other people and use those terms and feel what it's like to feel like an expert. And expertise consists of both disciplinary knowledge, the sort of static stuff in the textbooks, but it also includes disciplinary practices. It's experts doing things in context that affords behaving like an expert, and they want to feel that, they want to experience that, and I think that that's probably a much more powerful motivation than a badge associated with a specific thing.
Okay, I think I'll take one more question and then we need to move on.
Hi, I wanted to ask, in the given examples you researched, what was the role of building technology? Because if I understood well,
what is the role of
building technology?
Building the technology?
Yeah, in a way that the time span was very short.
Yeah, in fact, one of the findings, Cheryl Grant distinguished between the 5 buckets, and one of those buckets was the layered project, where you're layering badges into existing content and existing technology. And I think it was like 8 of 12 succeeded, whereas the projects that attempted to build, there were about 9 projects that within the context of their funding tried to build badges, content, and technology. One of them succeeded. So clearly that was a factor. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.